Hey there everybody, and welcome back to this training on alerts. This is part 2 of a 2-part series, and let's just continue where we were last time. So last time we created an alert in the UI where within 2 minutes, if the count of errors for this particular server group was greater than this static value, then we would trigger an alert, and this is the alert that was triggered. And here's the resolution for that alert. As you could see, much of the information is the same, less the triggering log lines that we see here. But those are essentially email alerts. So in the last video, we showed how to evaluate an alert utilizing the standard email integration. This integration makes it incredibly simple to choose a destination, but there are so many more options available for alerts. To see what's available, let's take a look at the documentation. Let's move to our UI and select the docs from the upper right hand corner. And we're going to move into the alerts page. And let's take a look at the sidebar here. And we're going to go into alert messages. Now let's scroll down to see what sort of options we have. So this is a list of our integrations. And you can see we have a PagerDuty, OpsGenie, VictorOps, and a Slack integration. We also have a custom webhook integration that will allow you to integrate into virtually any system that you want to, where you could define a custom payload as well as utilize variables. The bulk of this training will be on defining advanced alerts in the alerts configuration file utilizing multiple time series objects. We will also utilize template parameters to define alerts from a single template, and we will send the payload to our Slack integration. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to move into the alerts tab here, and we're going to take a look at the alert that we built in the last video. The alert that we built in the last video was errors on this app server. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to move into our alerts JSON. And what we can see are all of the alerts within the account, and we can see the alert that we created in the last video here. So the first thing we're going to do here is let's utilize some template parameters. And to make this a little bit easier, let's just cut and paste this alert to the top. And then we're going to add some parameters, and I'll show you how those work. So if we move into our documentation and we click into alert templates, we can see how template parameters are structured. And we're just going to take the syntax that we see in the documentation, we'll copy that, and then let's paste that into our alerts configuration file. And that is going to go above the alerts stanza. So alert templates allow you to define one alert definition and create multiple alerts from it. So what would happen here if we define these templates within the alert definition is 3 separate alerts would be created. So let's make this useful. In the example in the documentation, we can see that there's 3 different hosts that are coming in. And this is going to define an alert for each one of these hosts. This is just sample data, but what we want to do is we're going to do something very similar, utilizing this server host field. So what we have here is server host contains app server, and this alert now is restricted to alerting for the app server. But utilizing this technique, we can define multiple alerts, one for each application. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to start in our data. So let's move into the logs. And we're going to do a new search. And let's just look for the word error again. And then if we move into the server host value here, we can see there's 5 different server hosts. And what we did last time is we did server host contains app server. So it's pulling app server 1 through 7, I believe. In this example, we're going to define 3 different alerts based off of the data that's in this server host field. So we already have app server defined. So let's redefine that with our template parameters, and then we're going to define the rest of them. We're going to do scalar agent, and then we're going to do CloudWatch logs. So let's start with app server, and let's call this app instead. And for the value, let's take what we have here, and we're going to paste it for the first one. And then instead of statically defining this, we're going to utilize this syntax here, which signifies the passing of this variable, which will also trigger the system to see this as an alert definition. So now all we have to do is change this to the key, app, and now this is going to create 3 alerts. The first one is going to be app server, which is exactly what we had before. Now let's define the other 2. So this one contains scalar agent 2 and then some characters. So we're just going to do server host contains scalar agent 2. And then the third one is going to be CloudWatch logs. Leaving everything else the same, if we update the file, we should see 3 distinct alerts. And they're all named the same, so let's actually move back into our JSON. And we could pass the variable into the description to make the name more useful. So now we have it. We have errors on app server, scalar agent 2, and CloudWatch logs. So if we move into the first one that we already created, app server, we could see the dynamic data was passed here from the parameter, and this is the same alert that we were utilizing last time. And then just as we would expect, we can see the same thing here. So now that we're defining different services may have different thresholds. In this case, we're using 3 for all of them. And in this case, we can see there's a lot more errors. So for instance, let's say this particular service has a higher threshold for errors, and maybe this one is 10. We could handle that easily, so let's move back into our alerts JSON. And we could see we're statically defining this as 3, but we can have multiple values here. So let's rename this to threshold. And then instead of adding this as 3, we're going to add this as a variable named threshold. And for the threshold, we're going to choose, for app server, we'll keep that as 3. For scalar agent 2, let's make that 10. And for CloudWatch logs, let's give that another number, let's call that 5. And now if we save this and we go back into our alerts page, and we click on the scalar agent 2 alert, now we can see that the template parameter has changed. Now this is a really good segue into the next piece, which really showcases how powerful alerts can be, and this is kind of what I was talking about in the first video. So one thing that we can do is we can think of this as a time series object. And if we reference our documentation and we move into the defining rules directly, the first thing that we see here is the trigger expression syntax, and this is the object that I'm talking about. Each one of these can be evaluated against each other, and you could kind of read through how these would work. I'm going to explain how this whole block of documentation is going to work. So the prefix here is the function, and the function in this case is count. And this is the count of errors for this particular server host. And if it's greater than 10, it triggers. We could take a look at all the functions that are available to us here, and it's going to make sense how some of them work in a second. And like I was saying in the first video, the minimum is 1 minute, but you can go up to hours or days or weeks. And if you can read about how the syntax actually works here. The next is directly related to time, and it's offset, which is optional. So if that's specified, then the time window is going to shift forward or backwards. And then the next thing that we have is attribute where, and this confuses a lot of people, but this attribute where clause is optional. In this case, in our example here, we're not using that. So what we have is just a filter defined. And we could see the filter here. Attribute where is simply going to define an attribute that's present within the filter. And then you could think of this attribute as the y-axis of the graph. Whereas in this case, the y-axis of our graph is count of events. So in other words, if you don't define an attribute, then your y-axis is going to be count. And if you want to define a value here, then the y-axis here is going to reflect those values defined by that attribute. So that is the expression syntax. And the first thing that we did, this is a really simple example of the alert that we created, and we're evaluating it against 10. Like I was saying, you can use different functions here. In this case, we're defining the y-axis as bytes, and then it's going to be the mean of bytes. In this case, it's the 95th percentile of latency. Other things that we can do, and this is where it gets really powerful, is we can think of these as objects and we can relate them to each other. So instead of defining on this side of the evaluation as just a static number of 10, you could actually use a dynamic number here, and in this case it could trigger if the number of errors is greater than the number of successes. There's quite a bit that we could do with these. We can use logic here. As you can see here, you can evaluate them against each other, and you could also do math, as you see here. So if we take our example and we move back into the alerts JSON, instead of defining this threshold here, we could actually just define some sort of other dynamic object. So in this case, let's just replace this with itself, and these two are going to be equal. But one thing we can do is, in this case, we're looking for errors. We can show where this is not an error. So now what we have here is the count of errors, and if that is greater than the count of not errors, then it would alert. These are just examples. It might not necessarily be the most useful, but hopefully you get the point of how we can start thinking of these as objects and start evaluating them against each other. So what we're going to do for our final alert is add a little bit of complexity here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do count of errors divided by the count of not errors. For simplicity's sake, let's just call it 5%. And then instead of using the alerts email address, we're going to use a Slack webhook address. And in this case, I'm just going to copy it from here. If you want to learn how to set these up, they're really simple. Just take a look at the documentation. And now that we have that configured, and we waited a little bit for the alert to actually evaluate, and I actually had to change the value a little bit since that was just a demo value. But yeah, so now it's working, and it is going to be very similar to the email alert, where you could see the latest log line for context, and then you could move into the graph, the logs, or the alert detail. Or you could just click on the alert simply, and it'll take you to the Scalar alert page, where you can dive deeper into the actual alert. So that has been alerting within Scalar. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to our support team at support@scalar.com. It was a pleasure teaching you today, and I hope to see all of you soon.